Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Decoding the Unknown. As always, hello there, I'm your host Simon. I'm here, one of my writers, in this case Katie. Thank you, Katie, has written me an episode. Here come the Men in Black, the Galaxy Defenders. Anyone seen that movie? God damn, I haven't watched Men in Black in a long time. Didn't they make like new Men in Black movies? Didn't they make a new Men in Black movie recently, which I absolutely didn't see? I remember enjoying that as a kid though. It was great. Simon, I know you're not renowned as a huge film buff, but can you guess the highest grossing film at the domestic box office in 1997? I'm going to go ahead, and even though it seems insane, I'm going to say it's the Men in Black, because that's what today's episode is about. I mean, it's not about the movie, it's about the Men in Black as an actual thing. If you're stuck, it wasn't actually Titanic, which did obviously go on to become one of the highest grossing movies of all time. If you need even more of a clue, just look at the title of this episode, for yes, it was none other than Men in Black. Wait, in the first year, Men in Black outgrossed Titanic? Are you joking? Starring Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. Incidentally, when I checked this fact, there was a link on the IMDb page saying that 1997 was the second greatest year for films after 1939. And yes, there were some bangers, including Princess Mononoke, LA Confidential, The Fifth Element, wow, Face Off, yes! And Mr. Bean the Movie, and Batman and Robin. But we digress. Wow, Face Off is an absolute, I love that movie. And Fifth Element's also great. I don't think I've seen LA Confidential, and I've never heard of Princess Mononoke. Mononoke. I've of course seen the Mr. Bean movie, who hasn't? Is that the one where he like draws on the Mona Lisa? Just before we continue with today's episode, I want to tell you about one of my favorite sponsors, and that is absolutely Vessi, and this is their new shoe, just arrived at my door this morning. Smells like new shoe. Smells like new Vessis. Excited to wear these. This is the Courtside Classic. It's a blend of timeless design and cutting-edge performance. And what they mean by cutting-edge performance here, you've heard me talk about Vessis before. It's all I wear. And they are, because of a material called Dymatex, 100% waterproof. That's not water resistant. If it's raining outside, your socks will stay 100% dry. Vessis are just, I've got many pairs of Vessis, and I really don't wear anything else. This is a different look for them. Like this little thing on the tongue, the logo like that, this is a different look, and it's a stylish look, and I like it a lot. Look, you've heard me talk about Vessis for a long time. Whenever they bring out a new shoe, I get excited. If you want to pick them up, you just won't regret it. You just won't. It's they're just great shoes. Simple as that. So check out some Vessis at vessi.com/unknown, and you can get 15% off your first order. So thank you to Vessi for the sponsorship. As always, appreciate you guys. And back to today's episode. What are the ingredients of a conspiracy? You obviously need some strange or seemingly inexplicable event to have taken place. You need to find some other people who believe you or have experienced said event so that the news starts to trickle out, because it's not a conspiracy if nobody else knows about it. You then need some sort of pushback from assumed authority figures to let you know that you're on the right track and something weird is indeed afoot, and they don't want you to know about it. And then if you decide to tell your truth anyway, you're usually perceived as a crackpot yelling into the void. It sounds like Katie read the how to start a conspiracy theory 101. It does seem like it's like cults. It's like, yeah, you just got to take these steps. Here's the culty steps that you take. A book I read a while ago, and it's going excellent. To most people, the words conspiracy theory denote a slightly wacky idea someone's come up with, usually involving secret government sectors or groups of very powerful, shadowy figures. Maybe there's a smattering of aliens along the way. Of course there is. The fact that we all kind of roll our eyes at the thought that something might be a conspiracy theory could actually mean that the shadowy figures behind the scenes are doing their jobs. Are they successfully sidelining anyone who happens upon a greater truth than the population as a whole should be privy to? What if there are groups of people clamping down on things before the news gets spread far and wide? Maybe this has been going on for decades without us realizing, leaving the higher-ups chortling away at how much they can get away with. As an example, stories of small groups of men dressed in black suits turning up in the wake of strange occurrences to warn witnesses against spreading news of the event have been reported since at least the 1940s. So I mean, come on. Let me see you take a walk with me into the somewhat murky story of the Men in Black. I mean, this prima facie, isn't that ridiculous? It's like, okay, so something happens that the government don't want you to know about, like, I don't know, a spy plane crashes in your backyard. Of course someone's going to show up and be like,
hi, you're going to need to not talk about this, national security, blah, 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 blah.
Don't think this means there's aliens or anything like that. It's probably just the FBI or whoever's responsible for, like, shutting people up. Walk in shadow, move in silence. While things like strange lights in the sky have been recorded for centuries, it wasn't until the mid-20th century that extraterrestrial spacecraft started to be spotted with some regularity, in the US at least, with the term flying saucer making an appearance in newspapers in 1947, even though this wasn't an accurate description from the first witness, Kenneth Arnold, who described what he saw as crescent-shaped at the time. I guess flying saucer has a catchier ring to it than flying crescents. It's like, bro, flying crescent? You mean the moon? Oh, which makes it sound like you could have got him mixed up and just seen the moon. Katie and I, same page. Anyway, once Arnold had made this early sighting, the number of reports of unidentified flying objects exploded, with Project Blue Book, which was tasked with compiling and categorizing these reports, recording over 12,000 events or sightings between 1952 and 1969. Only about 6% of these reports couldn't easily be explained away, although they also included examples with not enough information to make any kind of conclusion, so the real number was even smaller. Yeah, 6,000 is still quite a lot, though, isn't it? I mean, I don't believe that they're alien spacecraft, but it's still quite a lot. An easy explanation doesn't mean no explanation, so UFO people, relax. I haven't been converted yet. Do I think aliens are real? Yes. UFOs on Earth? No. A further panel looked at the results and also concluded that while some reports could not be immediately explained, they were not of any particular security concerns and were also not proof of extraterrestrial visitations. Obviously, any findings published from this sort of government inquiry just scream of cover-ups and won't convince anybody who believes that what they saw was extraterrestrial, but it was in fact a military aircraft, a cloud, or that old chestnut of a weather balloon. And extra things like somber strangers turning up to warn you of spreading your story will hardly change your mind either. I mean, but of course the government has things to hide. Like, they're testing new spy all the time, and if it crashes in your garden, they're going to want you to shut up. You know, you're just telling your friend about the weird string of lights you saw over the water, and like, boom, black suits fill up the room. So when did these dudes enter the chat? For yes, even though Hollywood has succumbed to wokeness gone mad and added a female agent in recent movie franchise entries, we all know women did not develop brains or independent thought until at least the 1970s, so there were no women in black. That's debatable, Katie. You think women have developed independent thought? They're just an extension of their men. Come on.
Wow. I can't believe every single one of them kicked you in the dick.
That means that, for the purposes of making everyone's life a tad easier, we can handily refer to these people as men in black without fear of being sexist. We could also refer to them as black men, like Gray Barker did, of whom more later, but let's not. Let's go back to 1947 and Kenneth Arnold again, because it seems that the early UFO sightings also came with the early versions of the Men in Black. Shortly after Arnold's encounter, where he saw 9 shiny shapes flying at incredible speeds, he was contacted to interview another UFO witness called Harold Dahl. Dahl, and a few other people on the boat he had been on, had witnessed 6 very large donut-shaped aircraft in the sky over Maury Island in Washington's Puget Sound. This had apparently taken place just a few days before Arnold had seen his flying crescents. Dahl had then seen what he described as being like newspapers, but were actually pieces of metal spewing from the craft and something akin to lava that landed on their boat, killing his dog. What are you talking about? How's that akin to a newspaper? His boss, Fred Chrisman, also witnessed the UFO when he went to check on the area later and picked up some of the fallen debris. Kenneth Arnold asked some pilot pals to investigate, so Army Air Corps intelligence officers Captain William L. Davidson and First Lieutenant Frank M. Brown flew to Washington, interviewed Dahl, and took some samples with them when they left. Tragically, or maybe suspiciously, the B-25 bomber they were piloting crashed on the way back to California and both men died. What a coincidence! This whole thing became known as the Maury Island incident. Dahl also told Kenneth Arnold that the day after his sighting, he had a strange visitor come to his door. According to Gray Barker's book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, it says, quote, "The man who wore a black suit invited him to breakfast. As soon as they sat down to eat, the man began telling Dahl everything that happened to him the day before, down to the most minute detail. Dahl was speechless. It was as if the man had actually been there with him, witnessing every action of the donut-shaped objects. As Dahl sat there, shaken and speechless, the visitor began to threaten him in a strange manner. "What I have said is proof to you that I know a great deal more about this experience of yours than you will want to believe. If Dahl loved his family and didn't want anything bad to happen, he would not discuss the experience with anyone." Dahl related the happenings on the island to Arnold, only after much persuasion. Chronologically then, we've got what's generally recognized as the first official UFO sighting, and it's already got creepy weird men attached to it, so let's carry on, shall we? In 1952, possible Futurama influence, Albert K. Bender contacted Gray Barker, of whom more later, to ask about an organization that he'd set up called the International Flying Saucer Bureau, or IFSB. Flying Saucer Bureau sounds very official, but it's just his club, basically. Like, calling something a bureau makes it sound so serious. Bender and a group of other friends were busy investigating all kinds of flying saucer sightings and delving deep into possible physical evidence, as well as embroiling themselves in all kinds of theories about where the flying saucers were coming from and why. And then, in 1953, Bender's attitude abruptly shifted and the whole thing came to a grinding halt. He had a visit from 3 men in black. As per They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, quoting here, 3 men in black suits with threatening expressions on their faces. 3 men who walk in on you and make certain demands. 3 men who know that you know what the saucers really are. They don't want you to tell anyone else what you know. After they got through with you, you wished you'd never have heard the word saucer. You turned pale and got awfully sick. You couldn't get anything to stay in your stomach for 3 long days. Now, Bender was supposedly so spooked by this encounter that he didn't write about it himself until several years later in his own book, Flying Saucers and the 3 Men, which was written in conjunction with Gray Barker, of whom more later. I get the feeling this Gray Barker is going to be an important figure in today's episode.
You're correct.
Barker goes on to say in the next chapter of his own book, if Bender was closed down by the United States government, the 3 men probably had good reasons. But Bender never told us who the 3 men were or who sent them, only that they showed credentials. But government men do not dress so conspicuously, especially if they are on a secret mission. All the 3 men were dressed similarly, in black. I'm not certain they were government men who frightened Bender, almost out of reason, that unusual day in September 1953, though I believe Bender steered our conjectures in that direction. The quote ends. Intriguing. This 1953 encounter and subsequent publishing of Barker's book in 1956 was when the term Men in Black was coined and when the idea of them was spread to the public at large, or at least the public who read Barker's book. Let's fast forward to 1975 now, and a book by John Keel called The Mothman Prophecies. Oh, I think I've seen this movie. Isn't that the one where it's like, if you see the Mothman, it means like something bad's gonna happen? I handily wrote the script for the Mothman episode, already covered on DTU. So yeah, there's something about a bridge, people seeing some Mothman on a bridge and then the bridge collapses or something. It struck me as nonsense. So I feel perfectly valid in plagiarizing my own work. The whole Mothman thing happened in the mid-1960s. Oh, and there were tons of reports of a large winged flying creature with glowing red eyes terrorizing the inhabitants of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. This cryptid also became linked to a few disasters, so people were debating whether it was causing these events or warning people about them. Any mention of the Mothman always reminds me to check the Mothcam live stream, which records a big Mothman statue outside the Mothman Museum. And yes, sure enough, a mother and daughter are walking by taking selfies. They probably don't realize I'm spying on them though, so let's leave them to it. I bet that camera's caught some interesting incidents over the years. Anyway, back to John Keel. I completely forgot about that. The Mothman camera. As a UFO investigator, he was alerted to the strange sightings in Point Pleasant and headed over there in December 1966 to see what he could see. As well as taking many witness accounts of encounters with a strange creature, he and a few companions went to the area where it had popped up the most. While in the first instance, Keel had no personal experiences, others in the group were variously freaking out, hearing strange metallic noises, and one started bleeding from the ear. Keel went back to the area by himself later that night and mapped out a small zone of fear, which was an area where he felt an inexplicable surge of dread when he walked through it and put down to some sort of ultrasonic UFO activity. When he returned the next morning, the zone of fear was no longer there. Keel had interviewed practically everyone in town, it seems, from isolated farmers to police officers, so his name was familiar around Point Pleasant. And that's when the Men in Black came calling. According to Keel's book, The Mothman Prophecies, these new strangers in town became quite prevalent after they apparently found out they'd been poking around into the strangeness surrounding the Mothman sightings and also UFOs that had been seen in the area. People in town later told him of numerous instances of these men turning up and questioning them specifically about Keel, or even saying that they were working with him, which he assures the reader they were not. Most of these visitors were dressed weirdly or just had general odd demeanor about them. After the Silver Bridge collapse the following year in 1967, there we go, there's that bridge collapse, many people linked this with the increased Mothman sightings, and the creature became tied to the disaster. Mary Ha was a reporter and office manager of the Athens Messenger and saw two men in black shortly after the bridge collapse when they came to her Point Pleasant office inquiring about flying saucer activity. This took her off guard, as the bridge had been the biggest news for days, seeing as how 46 people had died right before Christmas. She describes the men as, quote, almost like twins. Both were short and wore black overcoats. Their complexions were dark, somewhat oriental. She did, in fact, have a large file of purported UFO sightings, and when the men asked what she would do if she was told not to publish them, she said, I'd tell them to go to hell. The men left. I mean, it's a bit convenient that the woman who is like, oh yeah, I'm getting questioned about my UFO things, is also mad into UFOs. If she wasn't, I just don't... At first, I'm like, wow, this story seems like legitimate. But then he goes, oh no, she was massively into UFOs. And then you're like, okay, well, credibility dashed. Later that day, like, if I come in one day and was like, oh my God, I got a visit from the UFO people, I feel people would take it a lot more seriously because I constantly shit over this idea. Whereas if I was super into UFOs, people would be like, oh, come on, Simon, you're just trying to enforce your own argument here. Later that day, another strange man walked in. Here's how he's described in the Mothman Prophecies. He was slightly built, about 5 feet 7 inches tall, with black, piercing eyes and unruly black hair, as if he had had a brush cut and was just growing it back in. His complexion was even darker than those of the two previous visitors, and he looked like a Korean or Oriental of some kind. His hands were especially unusual, she thought, with unduly long, tapering fingers. He wore a cheap-looking, ill-fitting black suit, slightly out of fashion, and his tie was knotted in an odd, old-fashioned way. Strangely, he was not wearing an overcoat, despite the fierce cold outside. Are you kind of vaguely implying that he's an alien, with his long, spindly fingers? And is not knowing what a good suit looks like. Not sure that dark skin is necessarily linked with so-called Oriental people, but there you go. Yeah, it's the past. People be everything's a little bit vaguely racist. I guess they just had darker skin than the general makeup of people in 1960s West Virginia. Also, I was kind of surprised by the vast geographic and demographic area covered by Oriental juxtaposed with the specificity of Korean. But the Korean War hadn't been that long ago, so maybe Americans were just more comfortable throwing that nationality around. This man, who called himself Jack Brown, asked her the same question the other men had asked her earlier about what she'd do if someone ordered her to stop printing stories about UFOs. When she asked if he was with the people who had stopped by this morning, he said, No, I'm alone. I'm a friend of Gray Barker. It's that man again. Of whom? More later. Who is Gray Barker?
Who am I?
Jack Brown left after her basically told him to get lost, but popped up again sometime later at her niece's house to ask the same questions yet again and get the same answers. There are numerous other examples of these men in black questioning or following people in Point Pleasant. They were usually described as smartly dressed. Sometimes they were also wearing wraparound sunglasses, and they were usually driving around in black Cadillacs. Another witness experienced the following as described by John Keel, quoting, A large black car was parked outside her house, she said, and two men completely dressed in black with broad-brimmed black hats and turtleneck sweaters were setting up a camera. At first she thought they were priests. In Arnold Bender's Flying Saucers and the Three Men, he similarly describes his men in black as follows, quoting again, Their clothing was made of a black material, which reminded me of cloth used in the attire of clergymen. It was well pressed, appeared almost new. All the other apparel, such as ties, shirts, stockings, and shoes, were also black. They wore hats of Hamburg style, also black. The quote ends. Okay, I think I'm finally getting to see why these guys are dubbed the Men in Black. No names, no fingerprints. Oh yeah, this is from the movie Men in Black, where they burn the fingerprints off. Doesn't work like that, they grow back. While this does seem intrinsically tied to American UFO lore, there have been examples of Men in Black popping up in other countries too. Let's take the example of what became known as the Solway Spaceman. In 1964, Jim Templeton and his wife Annie and young daughter went for a nice day out on Burgh Marsh, which overlooks the Solway Firth in Cumbria. If this sounds like a lot of gibberish, they were basically near a piece of water that forms a border between Scotland and England. It was a lovely day, and Templeton, fancying himself quite the shutterbug, snapped a few photos of his young daughter with his Pentacon FSLR camera. Isn't it nice that nowadays you can just take your own photos without random film developer employees nosing about in your business? It is. It's so weird that you used to take films and it's just like some random dudes just looking through your holiday pictures. Do you guys see that Robin Williams movie, the 1 hour photo? So that's a creepy movie. Apparently, when he went to pick his photos up, the employee said, "That's a marvelous color film, but who's the big fellow?" Templeton was astonished to see the figure of what looked to be an astronaut in a white spacesuit directly behind his daughter. Oh, I've seen this photo. Another similar photograph showed no such strange apparition. There had been no one else in the area, apart from a couple of older ladies at the other ends of the marsh who were sitting in their car during the time the family was taking pictures. Kodak, who had developed the photo, apparently checked the camera with the original negatives and couldn't find any evidence of tampering or another explanation for the brief appearance of what was soon dubbed the Solway Spaceman. The picture spread through local newspapers and quickly went national and even worldwide. Yeah, there's a picture of it here. We'll put it on the screen. It is pretty creepy. It's pretty creepy. It's pretty darn creepy. Oh, I don't like it. According to the Rational Wiki article on the topic, quote, Templeton also claimed a technician from the Blue Streak missile project in Woomera, Australia, contacted him and told him that a missile launch had to be aborted because similar-looking spacemen were seen wandering around the launch pad. Okie dokie. Shortly after the story broke, Templeton also claimed he was visited by two sinister men in black who were driving a Jaguar and claimed to be British government officials. They produced a business card with nothing but a fancy crest and the word security on it, which is maybe what Jason Statham can flash around in his next Guy Ritchie venture. They also only refer to themselves as 9 and 11. They drove him around the Burgh Marsh area and variously threatened and cajoled him to publicly confess the whole thing had been a hoax, which he never did. At the spot the photo was taken, they asked him if that was where he had seen the alien, but he replied that he hadn't actually seen anything unusual at the time, he'd only seen it later in the photograph. At this point, they drove off, leaving poor Jim to go back home on his own. Dickheads.
Guys, it's a really long walk. What the f***, man? It's cold.
Another potential cameo from these monochromatically clad fellows comes to us courtesy of an 80s video game called Polybius. Oh, we've covered this. I believe Kevin Jennings covered this in the latest installment of his excellent Internet's Deepest Mystery series, but that hasn't been published at the time of writing, so apologies if I repeat him too much. And it's probably, I've read about it, I have no idea. I don't remember what it is, but I'm sure I'm about to find out. And it's probably too late to stop Simon from saying everything he remembers about this, but if you haven't noticed yet, I'm saving all the explanations for the end, so don't worry, it will all be resolved. If Simon's already given the game away, or you remember this story from Kevin's video, let's just pretend you didn't and carry on with this segment. Luckily for you, Katie, I have the memory of a sieve. Back in the early 1980s, a video game appeared in an arcade in Portland, Oregon. It was fast-moving, the graphics were quite advanced for its time, which probably isn't saying much, and it had puzzle elements mixed in with traditional arcade-style gameplay. People who played were said to have vomited, had severe migraines, even suffered from nightmares and seizures, and they all had vivid memories turned to fantasies. Men in Black were witnessed checking the machine periodically, although notably not to collect money or tokens from it, and just a few weeks after it arrived, the Polybius machine disappeared. It's not too much of a stretch to connect government organizations with spying on young people in the 1980s, however, some trains of thought have gone down the track that the Polybius machine was actually a CIA or similar three-letter acronymed group performing some kind of mind control experiment on the poor saps who inserted their hard-earned quarters, hoping for a brief respite from being told they were square by their hippie parents. Project McUltra and its scary psychological torture experiments had been made public just a few years previously, so having some weird game show up with out-of-place men checking on it definitely raised alarm bells, which may be why the whole thing apparently only lasted a month or so. Alright, so we've given given some examples of these so-called Men in Black showing up in relation to purported extraterrestrial events. So, were they actually a part of a secretive task force? Or what if, and bear with us here, what if the Men in Black were extraterrestrials themselves? I told you, like with the spindly weird fingers. I mean, look, I can believe maybe the Men in Black as like an organization that go around and hush things up. Not aliens. And no, they're not aliens that they're hushing up, and they are not aliens themselves. I don't believe that. I believe they're just hushing up about spy planes or whatever. Galaxy Defenders. Alright, let's start with the obvious. Were these Men in Black that everyone seems to automatically link to whatever government actually working for government agencies? Were they genuine people from the CIA or smaller secret groups tasked with intimidating witnesses of extraterrestrial activity into silence? And would this be because they didn't want the wider world finding out about those extraterrestrial things because they wanted to keep all of the knowledge about it within their secret group? You see, on the face of it, it seems likely that if these men did show up, then yes, they probably were working for some department that had an interest in whatever people had seen. But if we drill down deeper into this idea, it stops making sense pretty quickly. If literally one person with no other witnesses saw something weird and started talking about it, and then they were visited by some government goons who told them to shut up because it was none of their business, well, that's one thing. But to have pairs or teams of Men in Black turn up at a town where hundreds of people had apparently witnessed something unexplainable, well, that's another. Word gets around quickly when multiple people see things, and even if intimidation is the name of the game, not all of them are going to play ball with what they might assume is their government trying to silence them for their own ends. Yeah, especially in America. They're like,
freedom of speech, I'll see what I want.
And let's look at this from a higher level now. If these Men in Black were supposed to be silencing witnesses, they didn't do a very good job because we know all about them to the extent that they've now become a parody of themselves in a popular movie franchise. As Benjamin Radford in a piece on livescience.com puts it, if the Men in Black were real and effective at suppressing encounters with extraterrestrials, we shouldn't know about them at all. Yeah. They're so good at suppressing information about extraterrestrials that they've got a Will Smith movie about them. There are also a couple of ways that we could go with this if they were actually turning up to threaten people in the 50s and 60s. One is that they were indeed trying to stop information about UFOs getting out. The other is that they were even playing into the UFO or extraterrestrial angle to fudge what the sightings had really been, which was experimental military aircraft or whatever. By turning up pretty conspicuously for supposed secret agents and warning people to nod, wink, wink, stop talking about the aliens, it would make these people believe even more that what they'd seen was in fact extraterrestrial and not some new death fighter that the government was playing with. Exactly. Like, leaning into this is good for them because people are irrational. This layer of veracity given to the sightings, ironically by the people supposedly trying to cover it up, would then actually downgrade the interest in it from any foreign enemies who might be spying on what the US military was doing. They might be like, we thought there was some interesting testing going on, but the locals were saying it was a UFO and that they saw little green men with red eyes, and these little green men then attacked a cow and the craft did 3 loop-de-loops before vanishing in a bizarre flash of white light. So even if anyone did see something, there's really no getting any useful information out of this now. Yeah, it's just deflection. It's pretty good. It's good deflection. It's effective, apparently. Basically, painting any witnesses as kooks devalues them and takes the focus off whatever real aircraft might have been about that night. I covered this in an episode on the Battle of Los Angeles, but the same point stands here. The US government was concerned that civilians staking out military bases looking for proof of extraterrestrials in post-Roswell incident America might unwittingly leak classified military intelligence to Soviet spies. So, as I so eloquently put it, and Simon probably eloquently read in that episode, discrediting the ufologists was the name of the game. So, forget that Roswell crap, or maybe don't, because now we're veering into weirder territory that could point to the Men in Black actually being non-humans in black, so hold on to your Homburgs. The worst scum of the universe. Oh, I'm so sneaky. I deliberately held back the slightly weirder descriptions given by people like the population of Point Pleasant and Albert Bender because, to be honest, it undermined the whole angle that the Men in Black might actually be real government agents after all. So, here we go. Let's dive a little deeper into these oddballs that came a-calling after strange events had occurred. We'll start with Bender because it happened in 1953, a good decade and a half before the Point Pleasant stuff. Bender's initial experiences were originally published in Gray Barker's book, remember? But then he wrote his own story, which was published in 1962 as Flying Saucers and the Three Men. This presented Bender's account of the three men in black in much more detail than it originally told Gray Barker in his book They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, although they did actually work on this one together. Here's some extra info on those visitors in black, which follows on directly from the description I gave earlier about them wearing black stockings and stuff. Quoting, "Their faces were unpleasant to look at. Their eyes shone like tiny flashlight bulbs, and the teeth were pearly white, set in a dark complexion. I could not see their hands, covered by black gloves. A bluish radiance enveloped their entire bodies, and I wondered if this was giving off the sulfuric odor." It's like, yeah, they're covering up their alien hands. Fine. But they're also glowing blue. Why would you cover up the alien hands if you're literally glowing blue and look like this? The hands are not what's giving it away. Maybe it's just me, but wouldn't you maybe lead with the fact that they were glowing blue, not that they were wearing black shoes? Bender later gets transported to a UFO, where he meets three beautiful women dressed in tight white uniforms. Hey, of course you do. Look, finally some chicks enter the picture. They then take off his clothes and rub some kind of oil into every part of his body without exception. Dude, what is going on in your life? This was a dream you had. Blimey. These are also non-human ladies, as they have glowing eyes and their hair is silver. Bender has a great time being pampered in the spaceship, which apparently renders him immune to the dreaded disease, although we're not explicitly told what this is. Bender lived until he was 94 though, so maybe it worked. The Men in Black are aliens hypothesis is also strongly carried on through John Keel's Mothman Prophecies book, with multiple witnesses noticing strange things about the people asking after their UFOs. Jack Brown, or whoever he was described by Mary Hyre as follows. His hands were especially unusual, she thought, with unduly long, tapering fingers. Her niece also noticed this when he paid her a visit. In the book, it says she, quote, not only noticed his long-fingered hands, but there were also something very peculiar about his ears. They couldn't say exactly what, but there was something. One of the first witnesses to report on the Mothman in 1966 was Linda Scarberry, who had been in a car with three others when they saw the creature in the woods, and they drove straight to the police station in town to report it. In a later interview, Scarberry said that she'd been visited by strange men in black, and they, quote, wore black suits, black hats, and sunglasses. They drove black cars, Cadillacs, I think. They looked like human beings, but their skin was somewhat transparent. You could see the veins in their hats very clearly. Their fingers were longer than a normal person's fingers as well. Daddy shook hands with them, and he said they were awkward in shaking hands. They seemed to not know what to do or how to shake hands. Another local told Mary Hyre of an encounter she'd had in 1966. He looked like a normal man and was grinning broadly. He wore a black coat and kept his arms folded with his hands out of sight, under his armpits. Maybe he was hiding those long fingers? Jane Parrow had this weird encounter, as related by Keel, quoting again, a large black Cadillac came down the street and stopped next to them. The rear door opened and a man climbed out with a big grin on his face. He was about 5 feet 8 inches tall, with dark skin and oriental eyes. Jane thought he looked like a Hawaiian. He had an air of someone very important and was dressed in a well-cut, expensive-looking suit of the same grey material that was shiny like silk but was not silk. Okay. It's not some alien material then, is it? It's probably like polyester or some shit. The mysterious Jag Brown was described as being about 5 feet 7 inches tall, and a Mrs. Ralph Butler, who apparently doesn't have her own first name, opened the door. Oh yeah, in the past, like Mr. and Mrs. Ralph Butler. Opened the door to a man claiming to be Major Richard French of the US Air Force. Quoting, his neat grey suit and everything else he was wearing appeared to be brand new. Even the soles of his shoes were unscuffed, unwalked upon. He was about 5 feet 9 inches tall, with an olive complexion and a pointed face. His hair was dark and very long, too long for an Air Force officer, Mrs. Butler thought. There are frequent references to oriental features and dusky complexions, but while we never find out what was so weird about their ears, I think we're getting the picture. They also behaved oddly, for example, grabbing a pen from Mary Hyre's office and rushing off with it, cackling maniacally. Major Richard French didn't know he was supposed to eat jello with a spoon and tried drinking it out of the bowl. That silly so-and-so. Another sighting by a man from Ohio says, when I opened the door, I saw this man standing in my living room. He was dressed in all black. I couldn't see his face, but he was about 5 feet 9. It was probably just a burglar, mate. Thanks, man from Ohio. That really didn't add anything useful to this story. Oh, I mean, yeah, but is is anything. It's just like random witnesses who say they saw weird alien men come to the door. Come on. I need some evidence. Okay, before we get into the debunking section, let's circle back to the "are they real" question. We mentioned that governments might have a vested interest in stoking UFO rumors to discredit potential witnesses and mask details of real military experiments. So let's spend a few minutes on this. Men in Black did exist, although probably not exactly as we've described them so far. They also probably didn't wear black suits, but just calling them men would be a bit confusing, so I'm using the term to mean government agents interacting somewhat untruthfully with members of the public. A 2013 documentary called Mirage Men highlights former Air Force Special Investigations Officer Richard Doty as someone who infiltrated the UFO community. As per an article by Steve Rose in The Guardian, Doty and his colleagues fed credulous ufologists lies and half-truths, knowing their fertile imagination would do the rest. In return, they were apprised of chatter from the community, thus alerting the military when anyone was getting close to their top-secret technology. And if the Soviets thought the US really was communicating with aliens, well, all the better. Doty was also apparently involved in the Majestic 12 document leak, which was also covered in the Battle of Los Angeles episode. We can't take his word 100% as genuine, though, as the original writer of the Mirage Men book, Mark Pilkington, says, some of what he says was true and a lot of it wasn't, or was a version of the truth. I have no doubt Rick was at the bottom of a ladder that stretches all the way to Washington. It's unclear to what extent he was following orders and to what extent he was taking matters into his own hands. Of course, if Doty really was a government agent tasked with basically lying for a profession, can we trust anything he says? Rose says at the end of the piece, as always in the conspiracy theory hall of mirrors, it's possible to flip the hypothesis on its head. What if the lies and hoaxes Mirage Men reveals are simply a smokescreen for the fact that authorities really do know secrets about extraterrestrials? All right, well, yeah, but that doesn't mean there's any extra proof, does it? Well, we have to pick a side at some point, so let's get to the debunking, shall we? Yes, please. I'm so skeptical. I think I've made my position pretty clear. Do the Men in Black going around telling people to be quiet about stuff exist? Yes. Is that stuff aliens? No. Are they aliens? Definitely not. Interlude. Shades of Grey. But first, it's time for our section on Gray Barker. Yes! More of him now! Yes! Gray, who are you?
Who are you?
This is a character who sits exactly between the witness accounts of Men in Black and the debunking part of this episode. We've mentioned him several times already, and indeed he popped up in other things as I carried on researching. So who was this man? Born in 1925, Barker was a writer with a long-standing interest in stories about extraterrestrials. He primarily published books relating to UFO experiences and other paranormal activities, with other titles including The Silver Bridge, which drew a link between the Mothman and the Silver Bridge collapse, and MIB, The Secret Terror Among Us. He became friends with Albert Bender through their collaborative work with the International Flying Saucer Bureau, or IFSB, and indeed, it was through Barker recounting Bender's experiences in They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers that propelled the Men in Black trope into the zeitgeist of the 1950s and 60s. But was this Gray Barker a true believer like Albert Bender and John Keel seemed to be? Somewhat delightfully, it seems not. What Barker seemed to cotton onto pretty early on in his writing career was that this stuff sells. And we know this because it wasn't just him cashing in on other people's creativity. John C. Sherwood wrote a piece called Gray Barker, My Friend the Mythmaker, which was published in the Skeptical Inquirer in 1998. The article basically says that Barker presented his writings as factual while knowingly making most of it up. As we've said before, if you're not a very good writer and you want to sell a fiction book, just call it non-fiction. Boom. Sherwood says that the intelligence agencies did indeed try and cover up or spread disinformation about purported UFOs, as we've already talked about. So while Barker might have used them as a jumping off point, Sherwood writes, but that doesn't contradict what I'm about to disclose about Barker's participation in and encouragement of actual fraud to perpetuate the sale of his UFO books and magazines. Yeah, is this fraud? I mean, it doesn't seem like it's illegal. You're just kind of being like, yeah, no, I'm telling some stories. They maybe happened to me. It's like, is Dan Brown, like, you know, he's like, all of this is factual or whatever. I don't know. I don't think Dan Brown's a fraud. I just think he's an author. Sherwood kept all the correspondence he had with Barker, and there are several pretty damning pieces of evidence about how the latter viewed people who really believed in flying saucers. In June 1968, Barker wrote this to Sherwood, strictly off the record. It's clearly on the record, isn't it? Because we know about it. Unusual interest and fixation upon UFOs represents, in my opinion, a definite symptom of neurosis. I cannot, again off the record, bear for very long most of the people and the fans of saucerdom, mainly because most of them are oral aggressors, i.e. they talk all the time about saucers and make you listen. I do genuinely like a few sorcerers and former sorcerers like yourself who, along with their interest in saucers, seem to be pretty sane and can have a sense of humor about it. The quote ends. I've never heard of UFO fans being referred to as sorcerers before, but what a great word. It gives the whole thing a bit of a magical twist. It does, doesn't it? Just as much nonsense. Barker is blatantly open about presenting made-up things as true in other correspondence with Sherwood. For example, when Sherwood disbanded a small UFO group he had created, Barker wrote to him urging him to keep up the story that the Men in Black had pressured the group to shut down. Quoting again, I'll always be glad to print an article by you if you tell the real or made-up story of how these strange forces made you quit. You might as well go out of sources in the usual syndrome. I mean, I'm in the wrong business. I should just be like, I saw a flying saucer last night in the sky. It wasn't the moon. It wasn't crescent at all. It was real. And that would get more views than actually making factual content. I'm in the wrong business. Sherwood hadn't disbanded his group because of Men in Black, by the way. It was because he was too busy with college work to keep it running. Barker also got Sherwood to adapt a science fiction story he had written called Flying Saucers, Time Machines to present as a factual piece under the pseudonym Dr. Richard H. Pratt. He wrote, try to make it as technical as possible to make it look like a real scientific report. The real scientists who read our zine will see the hoax, and I hope take it as a joke. Later on, following publication of the piece, he wrote, evidently the fans swallowed this with one gulp. So I think it's clear that Gray Barker knew what his audience wanted and was happy to dish it out for them, never mind whether it was all fiction or not. Yeah, he's just trying to sell a magazine. I respect the hustle, dude. He was also involved in another hoax played on George Adamski, who was a notorious sorcerer, I guess we can call him, who had photos and stories galore of alien encounters. His photos were easily explained as close-ups of various normal bits of equipment, such as lamps and his...
Check out this flying saucer.
It's like, mate, that's a picture of a lamp. You just took real close. We can see it's a lamp.
And his stories of meeting and flying around with aliens have left people unsure if everything was a hoax or whether he was just a bit of an attention-seeking oddball. Anyway, in 1957, Adamski received a letter from R.E. Straith of the U.S. State Department saying things like, while certainly the department cannot publicly confirm your experiences, it can, I believe, with propriety, encourage your work. Is that something that they actually sent him? I mean, it's also funny because they're like, carry on with the work. It's doing wonders for covering up our mysterious plane program. Adamski obviously took this as an official endorsement of his claims and kept using it as proof of government support in his talks and appearances over the years, much to the annoyance of the FBI. This led to special agents repeatedly asking Adamski to stop using the letter, which only gave him more fuel to say that the FBI were trying to silence him. In 1967, Barker published Book of Adamski, detailing Adamski's story and calling the Straith letter, quote, one of the great unsolved mysteries of the UFO field. I already solved it. They want to encourage this stuff. George Adamski had died 2 years previously in 1965, but it wasn't until 1984, just after Gray Barker died, that his friend James Mosley confessed, although it had been long suspected, that he and Barker created the letter together as a prank. Or he just made that shit up. Now, before we all embrace him as our new best friend, it does seem that Barker had a mean streak that helped him exploit his main audience. Writing to Sherwood in 1970, Barker said, "The kooky books are about all that I can sell these days. I lost the sensible subscribers to Saucer News long ago, so I get a kick out of letting it reflect the utter mental illness of the field." Cynical much, Mr. Barker? Nah, fuck it. I love him. I love this dude. That's because I am like him. I'm such a cynical dickhead, but I'm just like, yes, Barker, yes, you and me. What we've learned in this section is the early mentions of the Men in Black were practically all concocted by Gray Barker, probably with a big smile on his face the whole time. Let's wrap this up. What you think you saw, you did not see. We mentioned more examples than those just directly from the typewriter of Gray Barker in this episode, so let's see if we can explain any of the other Men in Black sightings. The first reported alleged UFO sighting in modern times that kicked off the whole phenomena was Kenneth Arnold, a pilot who saw a chain of unidentified objects flying at incredible speed. While no mysterious Men in Black came to visit him, he was contacted to interview Harold Dahl, who had also seen unidentified flying objects over Maury Island just a few days before Arnold had gone public. Dahl was invited to breakfast with a man in a black suit, if you recall, who threatened him and his family if Dahl told anyone about what he'd seen. I remember.
Great job.
The threat was obviously not that bad, as here was Harold Dahl relating the entire thing to Kenneth Arnold not long after. So, what do we make of this? Number one, was Kenneth Arnold a journalist or a professional interviewer of some sort? No, he was a pilot and a businessman, so what was he even doing there? One hypothesis is that as he had been a credible, seemingly genuine and well-known witness to a recent UFO sighting, he would add a layer of credibility to this story too. In fact, Arnold had been asked to do the interview by Raymond Palmer, who had been publishing sci-fi stories for several years already, and who seemed to be a proto-Gray Barker by presenting as fact what was clearly fiction. It seemed that he correctly assumed that Arnold would hear Dahl out and not question a supposed fellow UFO witness too closely. But what about the Men in Black aspect? Number two, I got much of the information about Dahl's encounter with the Men in Black from Gray Barker's They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, so I think given what we now know about him, we can add more than a liberal pinch of salt to that account. Yeah, we can fairly say just write it off as just being nonsense. Number three is that the whole Maury Island incident has been debunked as a hoax. Well, there we go, nail in that coffin, isn't it? Maybe Dahl and his colleague Chrisman were trying to get notoriety and a bit of money off their supposed UFO fragments, but when the plane that picked them up crashed and 2 more people died,
Do I need you to survive?
it didn't seem so funny anymore. If the sighting had been genuine, you would have expected more people to come forward and corroborate the event, as large donut-shaped craft spewing metal and lava chunks from the sky would surely have been visible for miles around. In this case, I think we can dismiss the encounter with the Man in Black as either made up whole cloth as per the rest of the story, or it was just based on a real government official visiting Dahl to try and get him to admit that the entire thing was a prank gone wrong. Albert Bender's encounters with the Men in Black, as reported in They Know Too Much About Flying Saucers and later in his own Flying Saucers and the Three Men, started off as the threatening variety, then morphed into an extraterrestrial encounter in his later book. It's worth saying that his original account to Gray Barker came out in 1956, whereas his more detailed personal account was published 9 years later, which gives plenty of time for things to blur and details to emerge that might not have been there originally. Yeah, even if he's not straight up making it up, remembering stuff like over and over again, you're going to add all sorts of details that weren't really there, and you might believe them to be true, but human memory is generally very poor for remembering. What I'm saying is that the two accounts are very different. With Bender's story, Barker took the Men in Black idea and ran with it, but we can also thank him for pointing out something that we hadn't really mentioned so far. Barker writes that the 3 Men in Black who visited Bender were assumed to be government agents, but government men do not dress so conspicuously, especially if they're on a secret mission. Exactly. If people were tasked with silencing witnesses, I suppose the black suits could be an effective intimidation tool, giving an official air to the encounter, but people in black suits in big black cars would definitely draw attention to themselves. Just turn up in a Prius wearing jeans and a t-shirt and no one would bat an eye. Barker also says that we only attach the government to these men, as that's what Bender had assumed without actual verification, but we can't really trust anything Gray Barker says, so I mean, whatever. Bender's later claims of alien travels and sexy times massage.
The 3 beautiful women lifted me up
Oh my god.
to their spaceship and oiled me in all my crevices.
What the fuck, man? Has either been discounted as a dream or a migraine-induced hallucination, given that he mentions throbbing headaches, bright flashes of light, and also sulfurous smells at the start of many of his experiences. And if they silenced him in 1953, what did they make of him publishing a tell-all in 1962? To be honest, I don't really know what to make of all of this, as reading it now in 2024, it sounds just like a load of made-up guff. It does, doesn't it, Katie? And I think that's why we can assume that it is, indeed, a load of made-up guff. All right, let's move on to all those weird people wandering about Point Pleasant, West Virginia, in the wake of the Mothman and UFO sightings over there in the mid-1960s. What I think we can immediately say is that if there were, in fact, strangers asking questions all over town, they were definitely not aliens. And how could I prove this? Well, I mean, oh, come on now. Come on now. Katie and I, same page. While there were lots of corroborating statements about these men from a variety of different witnesses, they were all published by John Keel, who may or may not have recorded them 100% accurately. He was a prominent ufologist, although his thoughts on paranormal events varied over the course of his life, from deciding that extraterrestrial visitors could not in fact be confirmed, to the possibility of ultra-terrestrials, which were visitors from other dimensions in a kind of multiverse theory that we're not going to get into here. He might also, shock horror, have been less than truthful about the whole Mothman thing. What? No, so shocking. His book was published nearly a decade after the events, if you recall, and at least one man in black referred to our mischief maker-in-chief, Gray Barker. Why would he chuck Barker's name into a book? Well, let's once return to John C. Sherwood, correspondent and sometime accomplice of Gray Barker. In another Skeptical Inquirer article published in 2002 called Gray Barker's Book of Bunk, Mothman, Sources, and MIB, Sherwood once again proves that the perpetuation of the Men in Black storyline was almost totally orchestrated by Barker. You don't even really need to read the whole piece, as the introduction says. Those who seek the elusive truth behind the Men in Black and Mothman myths should know that material touched by Gray Barker's enterprising hand is tainted by self-serving deceit. He launches hoaxes, joins others' deceptions, and manipulated people's beliefs. And I, says our author, was one of those who helped. John C. Sherwood there, freezing up all the flack. So, what's the connection between Barker's Men in Black and what Keel referred to as MIBs, a name that stuck? Well, first, as we just said, the Mothman Prophecies book wasn't published until 1975. Gray Barker had written The Silver Bridge, which touted the idea that the Mothman sightings and the bridge collapse were somehow linked in 1970, 5 years earlier. Originally, it seemed that they were going to collaborate on the book together, but when Keel got wind of how made up Barker's version was, he decided to write his own. However, Sherwood describes it as having a feeling of a misremembered diary. In later years, he tried contacting Keel to ask about contradictions between the book and other things that it said in correspondence with Barker, and whether he still held the same beliefs about secret organizations as he did then, but Keel never replied. Gray Barker, who Sherwood states had done little first-hand research, which seems true to form, totally admits stuffing the Silver Bridge with fiction. In a letter to Sherwood, he writes, "I've deliberately stuck in fictional chapters based roughly on cases I heard about. Throughout the fictional chapters is an undertone which explains the sightings from a psychological viewpoint, though this is never stated." Gray Barker is an absolute legend. He reminds me of the famous skeptic guy who recently, James Randi, ripped to the goat. In the Mothman Prophecies, Keel refers to Barker as a pioneer ufologist. Gray has made many outstanding contributions to the subject. This towering bear of a man was very hard to read, but his investigations were always thorough and uncompromising. In real life, however, according to Sherwood anyway, Keel knew Barker was a hoaxer and wasn't particularly impressed by him. He actually tells him off in a letter from March 1969, saying, "It is absolutely inexcusable that none of you bothered to interview a single witness. You went down there and looked at the sky 2 years after the main incidents occurred. This was tourism, not investigation, Gray." Yes, and Gray would reply, "And this is made up, not journalism." Keel. Shots fired. Hardly a thorough and uncompromising investigation after all. Quite the opposite, in fact. Why would Keel describe Barker in this way, though? It seemed that he valued Barker's reputation amongst sorcerers enough to keep the mystique going in print anyway. Probably because it made his book easier to sell. It all comes back to money, doesn't it? There are so many weird descriptions in the Mothman Prophecies that you can't help feeling that it's one long hallucinogenic trip. Here's another example with a stranger described as having, quote, "an unusual head, large and round white face. His face seemed angular, pointed. He had black hair, which was closely cropped to his head, as if his head had been shaved and the hair was just growing in again. There was a perfectly round spot on the back of his head, as if that area had been recently shaved. His nose and mouth seemed relatively normal, but his eyes were large, protruding like thyroid eyes, and set wide apart. One eye appeared to have a cast, like a glass eye, and did not move in unison with its companion." Quote ends. I will say that the description thyroid eyes appears 3 times in the book, always as a direct quote and in quotation marks. If you're not familiar, people with thyroid issues can have slightly bulging or protruding eyes due to inflammation of the tissues behind them, but it seems to have the ring somewhat of a derogatory term, especially coming from the 1960s. Yeah, like calling it thyroid eyes or whatever seems really weird. Anyway, as already stated, Keel's investigation and the publication of the book had a gap of many years, and he was at some point sharing notes with Gray Barker, so maybe some of Barker's fiction crept in. It could also be that people of the town were telling him these things, but they were all getting carried away in the excitement of the events because it was a big deal at the time, and there's still an annual Mothman festival to this day. Yeah, we already mentioned there's a camera on that weird Mothman statue, like all the time. It's the 3rd weekend in September, if this comes out in time, and in case you're thinking of going. Just in case. Maybe you're off to the Mothman Festival. Woo! Could there have been government officials sniffing around to see why all these paranormal reports were coming out of Point Pleasant in 1966? Sure. Were they acting in non-human-like manner to freak out the locals? Well, probably not. There are descriptions that really irk me, such as, even the soles of his shoes were unscuffed, unwalked upon. How are you ever in a position to see the soles of someone's shoes? And if you do see them and they are unscuffed, wouldn't you just think that they were new or just not think about it at all? Yeah, you'd just be like, oh, new shoes. That's it. That's all you'd think. There are also discrepancies between witness statements. We've mentioned several times how the appearance of the men in black was given as dark or dusky, but another quote from Keel's book states, quote, "This odd man shared the characteristics of Mary Hare's tiny visitor of only a few days earlier. Mrs. Hare said that the little man had unusually pale skin, almost a sickly white." The quote ends. That wasn't what she said about Jack Brown, whose complexion, she said, was even darker than that of the 2 previous visitors. It doesn't mention which other characteristics may or may not have been shared, so were there light and dark versions of these men, or were people just unable to keep their story straight? Maybe there were a few different-looking people around for any number of reasons, and when I say different-looking, I mean of a different nationality to the white majority in West Virginia. Maybe they were exchange students, travelers, tourists, a religious group. I mean, anything slightly outside the run-of-the-mill population everyone was used to seeing. Maybe they arrived at the same time as the Mothman by coincidence, or turned up in the wake of the sightings because they were interested in finding out more in genuine curiosity. As you can see, any of these suggestions off the top of my head is far more likely than that they were aliens masquerading as weird humans for no actual given reason. Yes, Occam's razor. According to Robert Bull, who wrote Men in Black, a preliminary report in 1997, he presents 3 hypotheses as to who the Men in Black could be. But actually, this turns out to be 4 points. Number 1, they are government agents. Covered that one, Rob. Number 2, they are projections, hallucinations of the witness. Yes, kind of mentioned something along those lines as well. 3, they are real, in a sense. Bull's definition of innocence is worlds apart from mine, however. His 3rd hypothesis is that the weirdness of the Men in Black can be attributed to the fact that they're actually droids controlled by extraterrestrials. Dude, I mean, okay. His 4th point is better, though, in saying that people have latched on to Men in Black as a social and cultural phenomenon in the same way that other supernatural things have been latched onto and blamed in the past. Bull says, quote, "The final hypothesis presented here, and the author's money is on this one, is that MIBs are a modern variation of other entities that have appeared throughout recorded history. Such entities have been named as angels, demons, jinn, fairies, poltergeists, Mothman, appearances of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the classic Adamski-type aliens, and of course, the Greys." The quote ends. We can carry on this example even further into the modern day with characters like Agent Smith in The Matrix and internet things like Slenderman, also creepy figures in black suits staking their claim in our cultural tapestry. These things have their moments, then we move on to something else. Okay, now let's turn our attention to the Solway Spaceman thing again. The spaceman in the picture behind the girl. The photo itself, while maybe jarring when you first see it, is easily explained and it's actually pretty hilarious, especially when you see the other evidence unwittingly taken by the photographer Jim Templeton. Let's take a quick look at the original photo of the young girl plus the apparent astronaut. Here it is on the screen now, and I'm also looking at it. I mean, actually look at it. Don't the spaceman's proportions and general attitude seem a bit odd if they're supposed to be facing the camera? The presumed left arm is at an unnatural angle, and light shadowing seems more indicative of the shoulder blades than the front of a spacesuit. In fact, I've seen the explanation of this photo so many times now that I'm actually having trouble seeing it as anything other than a woman with her back to the camera, as yes, that's what it is. Totally. But hold on, surely that would be obvious to Templeton if his wife was standing directly behind his daughter. Well, maybe not. You had to put the camera up to your eye back in those days, so it'd only be able to see what was directly inside the small viewfinder, and his wife was a bit further away, so out of his immediate sight. I've seen proof that the viewfinder of the camera he was using only showed about 70% of the total picture that would be captured in the photograph, thus it's quite easy to imagine that he just didn't notice his wife had wandered into the shot in the background as he was concentrating on getting a good shot of his daughter. Due to weather conditions and sunlight on that day, and at that angle, his wife, Annie, who had short dark hair and was wearing a blue dress, was overexposed on the print, making her resemble a spaceman. While Templeton kept saying that no one else was there, she was there the whole time and was presumably free to walk around as much as she wanted without alerting her husband to her exact whereabouts every second. Nowadays, it's easy to play with color saturation on photos, and any fool can clearly see that it's a woman in a blue dress. If you want further proof that it was just the girl's mother, there's another photo from the same day that shows the daughter again crouching in the grass, arranging some flowers in her hand. To the right of the shot, you can see half of Annie Templeton in a short-sleeved blue dress bending over and reaching for something in the grass. It's not a flattering angle, she's not posing, and it does not lend anything to the main subject of the picture, so we can once again assume that Jim, looking through his realistic viewfinder, just didn't notice his wife was in the shot. Tying this story back in with Robert Bull's Men in Black preliminary report, an article on the BBC about this quotes Dr. David Clarke, who says, "Ever since the invention of photography, there have been pictures of angels, fairies, and spirits. A lot were explained by lens flare or have been tampered with, but it fed into greater spiritualism in the 19th century. If Jim had taken his photo in 1864 instead of 1964, he would have taken it to the spiritualist church, and they would have said that it showed a ghost." Once the spaceman story was out, and those more innocent people of the 1960s were intrigued, however, Templeton was visited by some men in black. Or was he? There are a couple of hypotheses here, one of which we haven't talked about yet, but could potentially tie in with our previous examples. The first is that Templeton was just making the whole thing up. He was not a total stranger to the world of pranks, and lots of people are of the mind that once the story became big, he couldn't back down, so he maintained his stance that an interdimensional spaceman with a broken arm momentarily photobombed his picture until he died. He also kind of had to publicly maintain this belief as his young daughter got a lot of attention too, and obviously found this quite distressing, so if he came out and said, "Oh yeah, sorry, it was just your mum in the background," she would have been put through the ringer for nothing. The men in black, who referred to themselves numerically and abandoned him on the marsh, were just another facet of this fabrication to justify it to himself and his family. Or, and here's the other reason that could also apply to other Men in Black examples, it was a hoax being perpetrated on him. The hoaxer became the hoaxee. People who saw this story, or maybe even Bender's story, or heard stories about the Mothman, decided to play a trick on the poor gullible witnesses by cosplaying as secret government agents. What would it take? Black suits with black Ray-Bans, an air of menace, and well, that's about it. The fact that many of the Men in Black from John Keel's book are described as wearing ill-fitting suits doesn't have to point to them being aliens or alien puppets who don't know how to dress like a human. It could just as easily point to people who wanted to play a prank but weren't so heavily invested that they were going to go out and buy bespoke tailored suits for the occasion. To his credit, and it's the only credit we can really give him in this story, Templeton did himself say that he thought the Men in Black who visited him were not government agents, but were, in fact, pranksters. There's also no evidence of weird astronauts appearing at the Blue Streak missile project tests in Australia, and if they had, it would have been unconnected to the Solway Spaceman, as that is without a shadow of a doubt Annie Templeton. The weirdness of the photograph still persists for some people, even though it is now clear what it actually shows. It's been a long time since I was terrorizing my university housemates with the first Slipknot album, but I was kind of delighted to see that they released a song called Solway Firth in 2019. I can't guarantee this was inspired by the Solway Spaceman, but it does include the lyrics, "I won't show you the whole story, I won't show you the aftermath, I won't show you my allegory, don't look away, here's an unexplainable one." Sure, I might be retconning this in with my neuralizer, but it fits with the narrative we've built around revolving paranormal events turning up throughout human history, so I'm leaving it in. And what's next? Well, on to Polybius, the video game in the arcade that was visited by suspicious men in black. Was the government engaged in bugging video game arcade machines to spy on the public? Yes, the FBI did bug games with cameras and microphones to try and catch crimes that were going on in the shadowy alleyways of the arcades, but we're talking things like pickpocketing, drugs, and gang members. Was the government manufacturing arcade games specifically for mind control experiments? No, at least not in this specific example. If you hadn't heard of it before, the whole Polybius thing is an urban legend that started in the year 2000. Any references to people actually playing it at the time are either false or conflations with other real games. Men in Black may well have been seen trundling games in and out of arcades, but these were for the mundane purpose of reviewing the footage they'd taken, not to download your brain data. Ryan Houlihan on Inverse.com wrote, quote, "Games like Tempest were selected less for their mind control abilities and more because their cabinets featured glass bezels ideal for sticking cameras behind. The program was so extensive that it briefly caused a shortage of Tempest machines in the Seattle area during the early 80s. Just imagine teenagers watching Men in Black wheeling Tempest machines in and out of arcades every few days. It only makes sense that they would start ascribing outlandish motives to the agents." The good guys dress in black. Remember that. As I'm writing this, I'm desperately thinking of anything else I could be doing instead, and my eyes have come to rest on a sticker of Shrek that my daughter stuck to my husband's laptop. You remember why ogres are like onions? It's not because they stink or they make you cry, it's because they have layers. And here's another one to add to the urban legend of the Men in Black. Remember John Keel of Mothman Prophecies fame? In a possibly tacit foreshadowing of the content of his books, he starts you with a story of a mysterious bearded black-clad stranger visiting homes at night in West Virginia mere days before the Silver Bridge collapsed. In the next chapter, he reveals that the bearded black-clad stranger was actually him trying to use someone's phone as his car had run off the road. He posits that the time of night, the unfamiliarity of his appearance and the accents and the subsequent strange happenings in Point Pleasant might have got linked together in people's minds, creating a story that Beelzebub had visited West Virginia on the eve of a terrible tragedy. I'm not entirely sure if this black, bearded Beelzebub was actually a story going around the town, or if it's just Keel using this as a hypothetical example of how these stories are born, but either way, I'm not sure why he included this, especially at the start of his book. He comes to the same conclusions we have. Out-of-context strangers taking on sinister meanings in people's minds, and entire false narratives can be woven from what were actually perfectly innocent and innocuous events. Does this mean that the entire rest of the Mothman Prophecies is one big confusion that he knew all about all along? Or did he just not notice that he was debunking the Men in Black and the spread of urban legends in general before he'd even started the story? I don't know what Gray Barker had to say about this book, but it probably would have made a good quote for the end of this section, so feel free to insert your own. What was there is now gone. For a brief moment in time, Men in Black turning up in the aftermath of a UFO sighting were part and parcel of the whole story. But as Steve Rose put it in his Guardian piece, quote, "In the cold light of the post-Cold War, the evidence is starting to look pretty shaky for UFOs. Numbers at UFO conventions and clubs are dwindling. The UK's Ministry of Defence closed its UFO desk in 2009 and, like many countries, has declassified its UFO documents. If there were any smoking gun, you'd imagine it would have been found in our current golden age of leaks and disclosures. But so far, there's only been mere smoke." Nowadays, UFO fever has seriously died down since its mid-20th century heyday, and therefore, so have references and new examples of Men in Black turning up to scare witnesses into silence. Of course, government agents are still infiltrating things left, right, and center, but now it's going to be more online rather than in person, and they're looking for religious extremists, domestic terrorists, and cybervillains rather than worrying about some guy who said sexy women rubbed oil all over his body when he was in a spaceship. Hey! The movie franchise that started in 1997 has taken over the term Men in Black, and you now have to scroll a long way down Google results if you want to find anything that was anything but a sci-fi action comedy. Luckily, I'm slightly better at searching than that, otherwise this episode would have been really quite different. Obviously, the films have taken the idea of a government agency being involved in hiding alien activity in a different direction, but it's more than likely that the initial seed of this idea came from Barker, Bender, or Keel's books. I don't have cause to bring out the Danny DeVito unit of measurement in this episode, but you might be interested to know that in the first Men in Black movie, there's a jokey montage of screens in the MIB headquarters showing real famous people who are actually aliens living on Earth, and one of them is our man himself. He's wearing a suit and looking like he's getting ready to go to sleep on a couch, but hey, maybe that's what aliens do when they're alone. With Men in Black now firmly relegated to the realm of entertainment, though, maybe it's time for the real ones to re-emerge, as the fiction we are all familiar with would provide a really good cover. Basically, what I'm saying is, saw something strange, watch your back, because you'll never quite know where the MIB is at. God, it's been a long time since I saw that movie. That's the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for being here. If you're listening to this as a podcast, do leave a review. If you're on YouTube, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.
Sorry.